Now, before we dive into this, just remember we are talking about photos, not videos in this mode. So you want to make sure that you have that switch rotated to the camera position and not the video camera position. All right, so exposure modes on this camera are controlled with the mode button over on the top left shoulder of the camera. By pressing this button in and turning the main command dial, which is the back dial on the camera, you can change through the different available modes on the camera. And with a more expensive camera like that, you get less modes. You get 4 simple modes on this camera, and that is it. Starting with the easiest, which is P for program, which means the program is that the camera will figure out shutter speeds and apertures for you in order to get a correct exposure. Now, ISO is a separate topic. We'll deal with that as soon as we're done with this mode dial. Right now, kind of out of the box, the factory reset settings on this is for auto ISO, which we might go in and change when we want to do some little samples in here. So program mode means the camera is going to try to give you a reasonably set shutter speed that's good for hand holding. It doesn't understand if you're on a tripod or what your exact shutter speeds are. It usually keeps the aperture fairly wide open, but not completely wide open, depending on what aperture lens it is. It's just kind of this milquetoast middle of the road area, and is good for very simple basic photography. So if you want the camera in the easiest mode to use, it's the program mode. Now, if you would like to make a little bit of an adjustment to it, there is something called flexible program. By turning the main command dial on the back of the camera, you can adjust your shutter speeds and apertures in unison, keeping the same exposure, but just a little bit in one direction. So maybe you have faster shutter speeds or shallower depth of field or whatever it is that you particularly want. Now, this doesn't always work the way people expect it, and there is a bit of a quirk with Nikons that has been going on for as long as I've known about. No other cameras do it. I've tried to ask people who work for Nikon about it. Everybody just shrugs their shoulders and doesn't understand it. Let me show you what I'm talking about in all these cases. So we're going to press down on the mode button right here on the top of the camera. We're going to turn the back dial until we get a P in the top left corner, and we are in the program mode. Let's see if we can reduce a little bit of the information we see up here. So right now the camera is set up, and it is giving us a 50th of a second at f4 in here. I am just going to change the ISO because I want to make sure that ISO, I am pressing the ISO button and turning the dial in front to go on and off from auto. I don't want it in auto, and I'm just going to want a little bit more reasonable shutter speed and aperture combo here in the studio. So I'm going to set it at 1600. And so you can see our 200th of a second at f7.1 is our program settings. By turning the back dial up here on top, you can see the P has a star by it. And now what we're doing is we're getting more depth of field and slower shutter speeds. We can go the other direction as well. And we can go down to f4 because that's the maximum aperture on this particular lens. So we've gone as far as we can. Now, what happens if we go further with the dial? Well, nothing happens. What if we do it again? Nothing happens. What if we do it a whole bunch more? Nothing happens. All right, so we've kind of gone to the edge of what is available, and we've gone beyond that edge. And now you would think if we turn the dial back 1, it would change, but it doesn't. And we change it a bunch, and it doesn't change. But if we change it enough, it gets back in the range. And so we kind of do this click into nothing. We're clicking into nothing, and it's limited, as far as I can tell, to 10 clicks. And so at some point you might be turning back and forth and there's no changes. And that means you need to go at least 10 clicks to get back into the range. And so I don't know what to call this, the click into nothingness at the end of the spectrum. It's kind of strange, but the idea is that you can change the program mode if you want it in a simple mode, but you want to have a little bit of influence over what's going on. And it's the easiest mode that you can use this camera in. All right, next up is shutter priority. Obviously here, this is where you get to select the shutters yourself. You can do that using the main command dial on the back of the camera. Select your shutters. You can choose fast shutters to stop things that are moving very quickly, like 1,000th of a second for an eagle coming into the river. You can go to slow shutter speeds, like water flowing, to get a nice blurry river. Now, this is all well and good, but you do need to be very careful with the shutter priority program on this because you need to have an available aperture if you want to set a very particular shutter speed. And so if you don't set an appropriate shutter, according to what the aperture is, it's going to blink at you and let you know that you don't have an appropriate aperture for what you're trying to do. So just keep in mind, anything that's blinking is probably a warning that something is not right. Let's take a look at this particular mode. All right. So we are going to press the mode button down, turn the back dial until we get to S. So we are on shutter priority now. Okay, so we have control of our shutter with our back dial. It's currently at 1/32,000th of a second. Now let's just change this down to, say, a 60th of a second, see what happens, right? Here at a 60th of a second, I've got F13. I can take a photo. Life's pretty easy and simple there. Now let's say I want a faster shutter speed. Let's go up to 1,000th of a second. Can we do 1,000th of a second? No, we can't. You can see right now the f4 is blinking, which means f4 is not a fast enough lens for what we want to do. And you can actually look at the exposure indicator over on the right-hand side, and it says that we're a third stop underexposed. So we are allowed to shoot this photo. We can shoot it, play it back, and it's a little on the dark side. What do you think happens when we go up to 2,000th of a second? Well, it's going to allow us to shoot at 2,000th of a second. It is, as the indicator says, 1 1/3 stops underexposed. Take that photo, play it back, and yeah, it's getting pretty dark in there. So if you do like the shutter priority mode, just be aware of things blinking or of that indicator popping up to let you know that you are underexposed. And yes, you can do this on the other end of the spectrum as well. If you were trying to shoot a 1-second exposure in here right now at ISO 1600, well, that just ain't going to work out. The F22 is blinking. The indicator says that we are well overexposed and it's going to be too bright there. So just make sure that nothing's blinking and that you're in a safe zone, you might say, for getting exposures if you're going to be using the shutter priority mode. Aperture priority is the reciprocity mode of the shutter priority mode. It's where you get to set apertures yourself. You can close down the aperture to f16 or 22 to get maximum depth of field. It can be nice for certain types of landscapes. And then you can open it wide open if you really want to have that shallow depth of field to have your subject very separated from the background on there. So in this case, the front dial on Nikons is kind of the default aperture setting dial. The back dial just doesn't do anything. It's just kind of an unused dial, which I want you to remember because we might need that later on when I tell you about something else here in just a moment. Back when we did shutter speeds, we did that with the back dial, and the front dial, well, that wasn't used for anything. Now, with aperture priority, it is conceivably possible that you could set an aperture where there is not an acceptable shutter speed, but it's far less likely because there are so few apertures and so many shutter speeds, relatively speaking. Let's go ahead and set the camera to aperture priority and take a little play here. All right, so we're going to press the mode button in, and we're going to turn the dial in the back of the camera, and we are at A for aperture priority. Now at f4, we're at 1/640th of a second. This is a maximum f4 lens, and so that's as much as we can do there. If we close the aperture down to the maximum depth of field, f22, that gets us to a 20th of a second. And so I can't get it to blink in here unless I was to go in and move the ISO to some extreme setting possibly. We're not going to worry about doing that. So aperture priority is a much safer mode to play around in the sense that you're not going to get overexposed and underexposed images inadvertently. You might get images that are not of the right combo that you want, not the right shutter speed, because you weren't paying attention. But I think aperture priority is a good mode as long as you keep an eye on the shutter speed, that it's appropriate for what you're doing. All right, next up is full manual. Now, full manual is my favorite mode on all cameras for a number of reasons. I get to have full control over exactly where it's at, and probably what I like best about it is consistent results. A lot of times in situations where I'm going to want to get a variety of shots and the lighting's not significantly changing from one shot to the next, I want to have consistent exposure results. Or it could be because I'm shooting under tricky lighting situations. And so things are unusually bright or dark, or there's a weird mix that just doesn't work well with the light meter and any of the automated settings on there. When you shoot in manual exposure, you do a few test shots, well, pretty much everything else from then on out is going to be spot on with where you want it. And so manual exposure is a great technique to use when you have a little bit of time to set up your shot and you want to shoot multiple shots. Now, the exposure indicator is going to be a little different in the viewfinder, where it's along the bottom and runs horizontally, and in the monitor where it's over on the side and runs vertically. And so just be aware that they are in different places. Now, the concept on how they work between both of them, well, it's exactly the same. The indicator is broken up into third stops and full stops, so you can clearly see when you are one stop over, 1 2/3 of a stop over. So you can be very precise about these. Now, if you are way off, you're going to get an arrow pointing off in the direction, which just means that you're more than 3 stops under or over exposed, and it's likely to be a pretty terrible exposure. So generally, a lot of times I like to get the exposure indicator in the middle to start with, and then depending on the scene, some scenes are a little bit brighter, some are a little bit darker, then you start working it from one side to the other as need be according to that particular scene. Now, when it comes to shutter speeds, there's a lot of interesting things going on here. We have a new top shutter speed of 32,000. A lot of the mechanical cameras with mechanical shutters topped out at either 4 or 8,000th of a second for the higher end cameras, and now we can go up to 32,000th of a second, and it does go down to 30 seconds. Now, what I've listed here on screen, well, these are just the full shutter speeds. The actual third stops in between I don't list because it clutters up my screen too much, but they exist in your camera and you're fine shooting them. And so you'll have these third stops in between. One of the other important shutter speeds that isn't listed right here is 200th of a second, and that is your top flash synchronization speed. And so if you're working with flash, that's an important number to remember because that's the fastest one you can set and synchronize with the flash. All right, now we also have, when you scroll down even further, beyond 30 seconds, is bulb. Now, bulb is a long time exposure where the shutter will stay open as long as your finger is on the button. And so you can do a really long exposure if you want to leave it on the button. Now, the best technique is to probably use a cable release, not actually pressing the button on the camera. But there is another version of this, and it is called a time exposure. And now time exposure is the same thing as a bulb as far as it's as long as you want it to be, but it works differently. You press down on the button to start, and this way you don't have to leave your finger on the button the whole time. Wait as long as you want, and then come back to the camera or the cable release, preferably. Press the button again, and that turns off the exposure. And so that's probably a really good system for nighttime exposures where you want to leave it open for a long period of time. Now, there is something called extended shutter speeds, and I love this. I wish more cameras would do this. And this is longer than 30 seconds. Why is 30 seconds the longest? Because I shoot exposures longer than that when I'm doing nighttime exposures. And so this camera allows you to go in and set extended shutter speeds. And you can turn this on if you go into D6 in your custom setting menu, and you can allow this to be turned on. Now, for these extended shutter speeds, the light meter is no longer active. And so this is going to be great for nighttime photographers who just want a longer shutter speed. Don't expect the light meter to work with it. That's kind of something a little bit on the different side there. So this is something that can be kind of handy. Now, these extended shutter speeds have a weird quirk to them that I want to point out. As you change shutter speeds on this camera, the normal course of action is to change the dial, and each little click of the dial is 1/3 of an exposure, 1/3 of a stop with the shutter speed as we go from 15 seconds to 20 to 25 to 30. Don't get your calculators out. I know it's not technically exactly, but this is what we say. It's 1/3 of a stop difference, okay? Now, when you go into the extended shutter speeds, well, what does it do? It goes to 60 seconds, okay? Well, 30 to 60 is not 1/3 of a stop. That is a full stop. And then from 60 to 90, that's a half stop. So if you turn on these extended shutter speeds and you're moving the dial back and forth between 15 seconds and 2 minutes, sometimes it's third stop, sometimes it's a full stop, sometimes it's a half stop. Don't really know why, just want to let you know to be a little bit careful when you're doing your nighttime exposures with the extended shutter speeds. So kind of an unusual situation. As I say, I don't have an explanation for it, but be aware of it when you're out there shooting those long time exposures, because that is something this camera is very good at, and it's a lot of fun to do anyways. All right, there you go, folks. The exposure modes. There's only 4 of them. You pay more money for a camera and you get less modes. But they're really valuable modes, so I think it's okay. All right, next up, let's talk about ISO. So ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. How much light are we going to boost on there? How much brighter can we make it? All controlled in the ISO. Press down on the ISO button, turn the main command dial on the back of the camera to control where the camera is set. So I'm going to throw the camera through my standard little test of ISO. The camera can go down to an ISO of 32, but 64 is the native ISO. So if you want the optimum performance on this camera, you put it at 64, and that's where you're going to get the cleanest data off the sensor. It means you're going to get the least amount of noise off the sensor and the greatest dynamic range. Now, if you shoot it at 32, it's still really good quality, just not better than 64. It actually has about a stop less of dynamic range. The reason you might want to go down to 32 is 2 potential quick reasons I can think of. One is if you need a longer shutter speed. You are shooting a waterfall and you're at half second and you want to get to a full second, you could drop the ISO from 64 down to 32. There might also be some extreme cases where you're shooting with a very fast, say like a 1.2 lens out under very bright light, and you need to get the ISO down so that you can set the aperture also at its very brightest opening. There might be some other unusual situations, but generally, if you want the best quality, you leave it at 64. Now, this camera, as you bump up from 64, loses quality. That's a fact of the matter. Not that much quality, so you can bump up to 100, 200, 400, 800, and onward before it really becomes a problem for most people to a quite high number. Now, as you go into the higher numbers, I am surprised at how clean ISO 6400 is. Very usable settings. So if you're in a gymnasium photographing a graduation or a basketball game or who knows what, you can set this camera up pretty high. You might want to run it through your own test to see how it works for you and your needs. But I think ISO 32, 64, even up to 12,800 for a lot of people is going to be very useful. Now, the high 1 and the high 2 settings, yeah, they're a little rough, but for surveillance work or some sort of technical application, they're there if you need them. So changing the ISOs is pretty easy. You do that with the main command dial on the back of the camera. If you change the front dial, that turns the auto ISO on and off. And so you can have the camera automatically figure out the ISO. You can set up the camera, and this is the way a lot of photographers like to work. They set up their shutter speeds and their apertures, and they just let the camera's ISO does what it needs to do to get an even exposure. And as far as most situations, I think you're probably pretty safe doing that. I don't particularly like it because you'll sometimes get inconsistent results from one shot to the next because the camera will see something a little darker or a little bit lighter, and it will start changing the ISO in that regard. And if you want to keep it at one thing locked, well, then you want to do it manually. Now, if you dive into the menu system under the photo shooting menu under ISO sensitivity settings, you can go in and you can really control the auto ISO to a much greater detail. We're going to go in and talk about that when we get into the menu system. But if you want to set a minimum shutter speed, whether that be a particular number or automatically set according to the lens that you have on there, that's an option as well. But just real quickly on changing the ISO, we have an ISO button that fits right up here behind the shutter release. It's very easy to get to. Turning the back dial will allow you to change. You can see that when we press the button, it turns yellow on us so that we can see what that changes. If we use kind of our middle finger, we can change the camera back and forth from auto to manual ISO. And so if you want to quickly turn auto ISO on, you can, or you can turn it off that way. So right now it's choosing 5,000 ISO if I let it do automatically, but I can force it into manual and I can work with it that way. And so it's quick, it's easy to work with, and you'll be able to customize it a little bit more as we get into the menu system. Exposure compensation right next to the ISO dial, another common feature that is going to be used in some of the more automated modes. Now, by pressing this button, you can adjust it either with the front or the back dial, your choice in this particular case. Now, the idea with exposure compensation is you can force the camera to shoot a picture that's a little bit darker or a little bit lighter than average. In my mind, this works best in aperture priority, shutter priority, or the program mode. Now, depending on which screen you're looking at, you will see either an indicator or a value of it changing to perhaps +1 or -2. And whether it shows it to you graphically or numerically, it's the same information just displayed in a different way. Now, as I say, I think this works best with aperture priority, but shutter priority program works just as well. And unlike a lot of other brands and styles of cameras, this can be used in manual. And if you were to use it in manual, what it does is it doesn't actually change the shutter speed or the aperture. It, I like to say, fools the light meter. And so let me show you how this works, both kind of in the regular mode and in the funky manual mode. So let's just work in aperture priority where we're at right now. We'll change our front dial to F8 because that's a nice little middle number there. And you can see that we're shooting at 1/80th of a second. That's fine. On top, we have the exposure compensation. I can turn the back dial to the right to get a +1 exposure. You can see when I press in on the button, it shows it to us in yellow. And over on the right-hand side, we can see the exposure indicator up there at +1. If we want to go up to +2, we can do that and take a bright exposure. Now, this type of feature is going to stay on all the time. So when I turn the camera off and I turn it back on, it is still activated. So if you want to turn on exposure compensation, you got to remember to turn it off. And so minus for darker subjects, plus for lighter subjects, adjust to what you think looks good. Now, if I want to put the camera in manual mode, which I will do now, I'm in manual exposure. Let me just go set up a normal exposure at F8. I'm going to adjust my shutter speeds. All right, let's just say 1/80th of a second looks good. Now, if I said, you know what, everything I'm going to shoot today is going to be one stop overexposed, but I want to do it manually, I could hit the exposure compensation. I could dial in a +1 exposure. So the camera is set to +1. The meter is now telling me I am one stop underexposed from where I want it to be. It's not truly one stop underexposed because if we reset this to 0, we can see we're spot on. I'm telling the camera, hey, let's make everything a stop over. So it's kind of fooling me into thinking that I need to adjust this to its brighter state right here. The indicator says I'm at 0. But when I press down on the plus minus, I know that it's really overexposing. And so if you needed to overexpose and underexpose, and you like to work with things manually, yes, you can use exposure compensation to fool you and fool the light meter. Now, if there is a true problem with your light meter, like it is overexposing or underexposing everything, there is a way in the menu system that you can go in and you can fine tune it in 1/6 stop increments. So this is not a long-term solution. This is just a way to set the camera up for shooting in a particular situation. And so if you want, you can also go in with B3, Easy Exposure Compensation. Remember how back when we were talking about aperture priority and shutter priority, there was a main dial that you used to change that main shutter speed or aperture, and the other dial on the camera just didn't do anything. It was not active. Well, if you turn this particular feature on, Easy Exposure Compensation, you don't need to press down on the exposure compensation button. So this is something you use a lot. You can be changing your aperture with that front dial, and the back dial becomes exposure compensation. It's very easy to change, which is why they call it Easy Exposure Compensation. Now, when you're in shutter priority, you change shutters with the back dial, and the front dial would then become exposure compensation. And so if you're the type of person that uses those modes and exposure compensation a lot, well, this is a very easy way without extra button pressing to get to those exposure compensation settings. All right, let's talk about the metering system on this camera. Now, this camera, kind of strange for a Nikon, because pretty much all Nikons have had a button for the metering system, But this camera doesn't have a direct button, at least at the get-go, designed and dedicated for the metering system. You can program one later on for it. So the easiest way, or one of the easiest ways to get to it, is in the I menu. It's a little shortcut menu. Hit the I button and you can navigate down to the metering icon, and you can go in and select the different metering systems. You'll also see this in the full menu system, which we'll talk about in just a sec. But for right now, this is probably one of the easiest ways to go in and select it. Now, they probably took the button off of here because most people just leave it in matrix most of the time. That's the way a lot of people shoot these days. The multi-segment metering systems do a very, very good job. So this is taking into account tone, color, composition, and distance of your subject to figure out what is the correct exposure. Now, this is going to be really good in mixed lighting conditions where there's just a variety of things going on and you want the camera to figure out what's the best setting for exposure when it comes to the light. Now, one of the things that I found is kind of interesting, and it doesn't have a huge influence, but it is influenced by where the focus point is. And I want to show you this because it is kind of interesting. It's not something a lot of people know about. And so in this situation, I'm going to back up just a little bit. I'm going to show you a little bit of the studio, one of the light stands over there. And we have the camera in manual, and I'm going to change it over to aperture priority so we can clearly see what's going on. Now, I have a focus box set up, and it's over this white area on our little display stand. We're at a 60th of a second at f8. f8 and 800 ISO is locked in. Watch the 1/60th when I move the focus box over to the dark part of the frame over here. It drops down to a 40th of a second. So it's taking into account where that frame is. And the brighter that area, the faster the shutter speed. And let's see if, where is it on the cat? So on the cat, it's a 50th of a second. On the gray background, it's a 40th, and it goes over to the black area, and it stays at a 40th over there. So it does have, or it is slightly influenced by where the focus point is. And just not a huge impact on your photography, but something that might be important at some point of time. All right, traditionally, cameras had center weighted metering. This camera has a variety of options actually when it comes to center weighted metering. You can either have an 8 or a 12 millimeter circle where most of the information is read if you want to concentrate the readings in a smaller area. If you want them in the tightest possible area, that is the spot metering, where you can get very exact results from a very small centralized area in there. And then there is also highlight weighted metering, which just looks at the whole scene and tries not to overexpose the scene in any way. And that may be very useful in some situations. And so generally speaking, a lot of photographers don't mess around a lot with the metering system bouncing from one to the other. Most photographers just leave it in matrix, but there are some other really good tools here for solving some exposure problems depending on your needs. And so if you want to experiment with these, I highly encourage it because you might find that there's another way of exposing your scene that just works better for what you're doing. All right, as I said, you can also get to the metering system in the full menu system, in the photo shooting menu, and you can dedicate a button on the camera if this is something that you're regularly going in and changing. All right, another great way of determining if you are getting the correct exposure is with a histogram. Histogram is a great way of determining in a more technical sense whether you are collecting all the information in the best way possible so that you can work with it later on. So the camera has a brightness histogram that you can get by hitting the display button. The display button cycles through a bunch of different optional screens, and the histogram is a part of kind of the standard display options, which are customizable. And as I say, this is a very easy graphic way to tell if you are underexposed or overexposed. And if you like looking at it live view, well, you can see it through the viewfinder on the back of the camera, and you can tell as you're changing shutter speeds and apertures where that looks best. And so it's a handy tool to use. Now you can also use this in the playback mode. So once you've taken an image, you can hit playback and you can see a histogram for that particular image. By pressing up and down on that four-way control on the back of the camera, you can pull up and see more information. But for some crazy reason, Nikon does not allow this straight out of the box. You have to go into the system, into the menu, and you have to check off the box for overview, and you have to check off the box for the RGB histogram if you want to see these other display options. I always find this frustrating because I'm teaching people about how to use Nikon cameras and this isn't how they work by default. So let's go in and change this right here and now, because I like to have options. All right, so we're going to go into the menu and we're going to go left, go to the major tabs. We're going to come down to the playback tab. And by the way, Nikon, thank you for moving the playback back from the first item to about the fourth on the list, because that's how important playback is. All right, so we're going to go right and we're going to come down to the third item here, playback display options. We're going to go to the right and we got all these different options. And for right now, I'm just going to check them all off because I like options, and I'll turn them off if I don't want them later. Now, the key ones that we were wanting was overview and the RGB histogram. So if that's just really what's important to you, then you can go see that. So I think we're done. So down here in the bottom, it says menu done. So I'm going to hit the menu for being done. And I'm going to hit the shutter release just to completely back me out. I'm just going to take a photo. And how about we do a little exposure compensation, and we'll do a bright photo, and we'll do a dark photo, and then we'll reset this because you don't want to leave it in the weird position. We're going to play things back. And we're going to go up, and there's our histogram. That's our brightness histogram. Let's go up again, as I turned on everything. Here's the color histogram. Now, if I go left on our multi-controller on the back, we'll get to our overexposed image and our more normal exposed image, and you can start studying histograms. And so becoming an expert in histograms is going to make you an expert in exposure. So keep an eye on those, and that'll make sure that you are getting the correct exposure in the camera. Now, one of the most important things is just the view of what you're shooting. Now, this camera has something called the view mode. This is D9 in the custom setting menu. And the show effects of setting is going to show you the effects of the settings like shutter speeds, apertures, and ISOs. So in this example, you can see I'm changing the shutter speed, and the exposure indicator on the right-hand side of that screen is going up and down, and the picture is becoming brighter and darker, which means the camera is showing you real-time results of what your photo is going to look like in its brightness. And this is great if you want to decide, is this image too bright or too dark? And if you have a good view through the viewfinder, this works out pretty well, and I recommend it most people most of the time. Now, it's not going to work out so well if you're using flash and some other special situations where you just want a clean view. And so you can adjust for ease of viewing so that your viewing experience is the best it can be. Now, you're going to need to pay a little bit closer attention to that exposure indicator seen here over on the right-hand side of that right-hand camera. It's going up and down, but the picture is not changing. It's giving you a consistent view. So this is the choice that you have to make. Do you want it to mimic your actual exposure, or do you just want it to give you a good view all the time? There are reasons for both, and that is why there is an option here to switch back and forth. So judging your exposure, should you do that right off of the screen that you're looking at? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on which one of these two modes you're in. This is a pretty important mode, and it's one that you might want to put into your favorites list that you come back to on a regular basis, because this is something that does get changed in need from time to time for photographers. All right, auto exposure lock. So the sub command dial on the back of the camera, which is kind of a joystick, is a button as well, which means when you push in on that button, it does auto exposure lock. Now, this is a customizable button that you can go into the F2 custom controls in the custom settings menu, and you can reprogram to do something else if you want, which is perfectly fine, but it is going to lock in the exposure. Now, this is one of the ways that some people like to work, and a lot of people, they never use it at all, and so this is a good button for programming later on. Let's go ahead and give this a quick little try out. So right now we are in the aperture priority mode. So as we move from side to side, let's go in a little bit tighter here. You can see that our shutter speeds change depending on exactly what's in the frame. Get it over here to the dark side, it starts going down in shutter speeds. If we press in on this, we're going to get an AEL in the bottom left-hand corner, and that locks the exposure in. And so if you want to position somebody in a certain position where the light's right. You want to lock in that particular shutter speed and then move it off. You can take a photo and it won't change in shutter speeds on you when you are in one of the automated modes. And so this button would be of no use to somebody who is using manual exposure. So good reason for reprogramming it, or a button that's available for being reprogrammed, you might say. Another way of making sure that you're walking away with the proper exposure is with bracketing. So bracketing is any time when you make several photographs with something changing between them. So the bracketing on this camera actually works in a number of different ways. You can do it with exposure and flash, just exposure, flash, white balance, and active de-lighting. And when we talk about a multiple of shots, how many shots? Well, it varies. You can do 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, depends on the scenario that you have set up and how big a difference do you want from one shot to the next. Now, this is often used for two main reasons. One is just to make sure that you're getting the right exposure, in which case a lot of people shoot, say, 3 or 5 stop brackets, maybe with a 1-stop exposure difference between them. There's also people who do high dynamic range photography. And the HDR work requires a number of photographs, 3, 5, 7, 9, at a wide variety of exposures so that it can pick and choose the best information from each of those images. So it doesn't really matter why you want to do it. We have a lot of different options on how you can do it here. And so if you do want to get this series in here, come in, set it up. Most of the time people are doing exposure bracketing, and that's what this first example is here. And this can be used with exposure compensation. So if you want to make everything a little bit brighter or a little bit darker, set it up, say, for aperture priority, and you could dial in a +1 or -1 exposure compensation, and then use exposure bracketing on top of it. One of the key things here is you want to remember to turn this off when you are done. Let's go ahead and set this up right now. We'll do a quick little exposure bracket. So we need to dive into the menu system in order to do this. Well, technically not. There is a button on top, but we haven't talked about the buttons on top, so we'll do it through the menu system. And so they're in the camera photo shooting menu. We're going to look for bracketing, which I know is down towards the bottom because I've been going through this like a madman. All right, so not multiple exposure. Bracketing, right there, passed by it. All right, we're going to go to the right here. Now, the first option is what type of bracketing do we want to do. And right now, auto exposure and flash will do exactly the same thing because we don't have a flash connected up to the camera, but I'm just going to choose AE bracketing. Number of shots, just for fun, I'll do 5. Coming down here, we can choose different ranges, and I like doing 1-stop exposure adjustments between shots here. And we've got everything set up here. Let me just double check, 5 frames, and we're looking pretty good there. So I'm going to hit OK, hit the shutter release. Now over on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see that there are 5 tick marks by the exposure indicator, and those indicate the 5 photos that we're going to take. And so let's go ahead and take number 1. That was the normal exposure. This one looks pretty dark. That was the darkest. That was the -2. That was the -1, +1, and the +2. And now we're back ready to set up another set of 5 shots. Now let's go back and play these back. And if we look at them in this particular screen, you can see down along the bottom that this is the +2 exposure, +1, the -1, the -2, and the normal. Normal because it doesn't say anything over or under. And so that's our 5-stop bracket series. All right. So isn't that great? Time to move on. What did I forget to do? I forgot to turn it off. Let's go back in here into menu, auto bracketing. And the way you turn it off is a little weird. I got to admit this. It's a little weird. It says 5 frames, 3 frames, 0 frames. Or is that off with 1 F missing? Or is it of? It's not of. It's 0 frames, which is off. Kind of looks like the word off. So you want to set it to 0 frames, call it good. And now we don't have that little indicator there over on the right-hand side, and it's now turned off. So 0 frames, OF with only 1 F. Not sure how you pronounce that. Off, not off, just off. Okay, so that's how you turn exposure bracketing off. All right, high dynamic range. We talked a little bit about this a moment ago. So this camera has a built-in HDR system, which means it's going to shoot through multiple photos and compile it into a final photograph, which is grabbing the best information from the highlights and the shadows of photos that were shot at different exposures. Now, when you dive into this in the menu system, you'll be able to turn it on for a series of photographs, meaning you're going to shoot a whole series of things, or a single photograph, which actually means the camera is going to shoot 2 photographs, complete one, and then turn the feature off. So if you're just doing it on a lark for one thing on, if you're going to be doing it seriously for a number of shots, then you can leave it on in series. Now, there are different amounts of exposure between the shots that you can get. You can have it set to auto, or you can set it specifically to low, normal, high, and extra high. And so I set up a little bit of a test where I had a subject. The queen is in the light and the king is in the shadows, and I wanted to see how much this HDR could bring up the shadows and hold back the highlights. And so you can see an example of what this does of something in pretty bright light and something in pretty dim shadows. And so it's trying to pull everything into a more normal exposure. And so if you plan on using this, I would recommend doing some testing. My general experience with HDR is that the in-camera, even though this is a fantastic camera, don't want to offend anyone, there are limitations to what the camera can do with its own processing power. If you have actual HDR programs on your computer, chances are it's going to give you more versatility in adjusting images that you shoot on your own. But if you want to do it in camera, yes, you can do it in camera. You can take a look at the histograms there to see what it's actually doing with the shadow and highlight information. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to check out. Save individual images. And so this is something I would highly recommend. When you shoot an HDR, what it's doing is it's going to shoot 2 images and combine them into a JPEG final version. And if you recall earlier, JPEGs have limited range that you can adjust. So you're probably going to want to keep those raw if this is anything important at all. If you're just goofing around and you don't need those RAWs and you know you don't want them, well, then you can turn this off and it saves space on the memory card. But if you are trying to do anything serious at all with it, I would recommend keeping those raw so that you could work with this and compile those in a proper HDR program later on. Active delighting. This is the way Nikon works with JPEG images, so does not do anything with raw images. But if you are working with JPEG images, to kind of balance out the tones in the image to make them look a little bit better. In general, it's really trying to hold back the highlights from getting overexposed, and it's trying to bring up the shadows so that they look proper and you can see a little bit better in there. And so if we look at an example of this, you can see where the shadows are in the histograms, and it's kind of raising up those shadows. And once again, on the lower level where we have a subject in the shadows, we can start to see more of this as we set this particular setting to a higher and higher setting. Now, this is a JPEG only thing. It is a one single shot. It's just the camera manipulating the data in this one capture. It's not using multiple images to do it like in the HDR. So this is a different system. This works a little bit better. This works a lot better if you are shooting subjects that are moving and you're trying to get a series of shots. The HDR stuff is for static stuff that doesn't move because there's 2 different shots and they can't have anything moving between them. This stuff you can have moving between them. So where might I use this? Let's say I was a wedding photographer and I shot the reception with JPEGs just because that was my thing. And I'm working in a contrasty situation where I'm trying to see people's faces. Yeah, I might try to brighten up those faces a little bit right in camera so I have less work to do later on down the road. And so that would be a pretty reasonable, understandable reason why you'd want to use this particular feature. If you shoot a lot of people, people's faces can get in a lot of shadows. There's a lot of curves and to human faces, and things get caught in the shadows, and we want to see that. And so that's a great reason for using that particular feature. This is the end of the exposure section, but not the end of the exposure talk. We're going to be talking about more things that can affect the exposure as we get into section 12 on the photo shooting menu, and when we get into section 14 on the custom menu, there's a lot of fine-tuned kind of behind the scenes type things that you can adjust, as well as customizing different buttons on the camera to do different things so that it's as easy and as quick as possible to work with the camera. But there you go, folks. That is your exposure controls for the Z9. Hopefully you've discovered a few little things that you can play with and work with out in the field, maybe solve a few more problems with. So try some of those things that we talked about in there out and see what you can make use of for your type of photography.